Hey guys, this is Nomiki Konst. You are watching The Nomiki Show. We are a new show and we rely on the generous giving by our viewers. So if you could go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, you'll be able to see more specials, earlier segments. You might even get some swag, some special takes from interviews. We are going to be putting all of our shows up on Patreon first. Before YouTube, and also if you can subscribe to our YouTube page. We are brand new. We are just over a week old, but today we are doing a special. I am not in studio, as you can see, but you know the importance of talking about this cannot be overestimated. We are talking about what happened at the Iowa caucus. The Iowa caucus, as of right now, they've not declared the results, and part of the reason they have not declared the result, I would say all of the reason, is because of a malfunction with an application that was used by the party, the Iowa Democratic Party. Earlier today, we saw spin coming out of the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, in which they immediately cast blame on Bernie Sanders, stating that he was trying to reform the caucuses, and this is what you get. And then they started to spin, saying the Unity Reform Commission was trying to eliminate primaries and replace them with caucuses. I am saying this to you as a member of the Unity Reform Commission. That is 100% certifiably, verifiably false. And that is coming from the Center for American Progress and Neera Tanden. This happened during the Unity Reform Commission, which, as a reminder to those of you who do not know, the Unity Reform Commission was a 21-member commission that formed after the 2016 flawed primary process. And it was made up of a majority of Hillary supporters, 3 Tom Perez appointments, and 8 Bernie Sanders appointments. We were tasked with reforming the primary process, the caucus process, and the Democratic Party and the superdelegate system. Now, just to make this extremely clear, and please reiterate this online, we, as a commission, only issued recommendations. We had no ability to vote to enact these recommendations, and furthermore, it is up to states, based on state law, to determine whether or not they are a caucus state or a primary state. Nobody, not even Chairman Perez himself, has the power to decide whether a state is a caucus or a primary, and some are both. All we could do is say, this is how a caucus can get better. And that was something that was unanimous on the commission. Might I remind you that Hillary Clinton won the Iowa caucus and the Nevada caucus, that her staff was actually passionate about the caucus system. There are a lot of people, former Obama people, that were on the commission that had a lot of positive things to say about the caucus system. There are pros and cons to both systems. I'm not going to go back and hash it out, but I want you to know that we did all we could to make sure that caucuses were more accessible, but the enacting those reforms was on the Democratic National Committee. And that's where I'm going to get to this next point. Nobody, let's kill it right now. The caucuses are decided by the states. All they could do is try to make the caucuses better. But the application is the fault here. And really what happened in the Unity Reform Commission was we had a very, very hearty debate over the budget of the party. The budget of the party has not been transparent. You may recall I was speaking on the last meeting of the Unity Reform Commission on C-SPAN. It was a little bit of a viral clip because I dropped an F-bomb in which I was talking about the budget of the Democratic Party being transparent and people being held accountable for the 2016 election. Because the Democratic Party and presidential elections who were working together, the Hillary campaign in particular, and some super PACs, they were working together, raising money from small donors to large donors. And the money was essentially being funneled into a handful of contractors. They had contracts with the Democratic Party and the institutions that work with it. So it's definitely a pay-to-play system. It's handing out contracts to cronies. But what we were trying to do was have budget oversight and accountability, and to be able to preemptively have bidding for contracts and examine whether or not a contract is worth bidding on. These are very large contracts. But even more so, we try to ban conflicts of interest in the party. And this was my personal issue. I wrote that little resolution that ended up being erased, mysteriously erased, when our recommendations went to the Rules Committee. Now, the Rules Committee of the Democratic Party was entirely appointed by Chairman Perez. And the Rules Committee decided which reforms were to be enacted and how they would be enacted. The Rules Committee, I learned as of today, was in charge of agreeing to these contracts. So this app, which we'll get to in a second, went through minimal process in which Chairman Perez, his appointees, who were not elected to the DNC, his appointees approved in a quick, very quick approval process of this contract, this app contract. And state parties and state party chairs were questioning whether or not this app would work. I now know this on good authority. I've interviewed DNC members, and they are saying that they asked questions. There's even reporting that as of last week, this came out today, that as of last week, this is in Washington Post, people in Iowa, officials in Iowa, were complaining that the app was malfunctioning, it wasn't working, and that the party, the Iowa party, was not responding. And furthermore, the chair, the Democratic National Committee chair, was not responding. Now, let's talk about the app. Early reports said that this app was attributed to Robbie Mook, the former campaign manager of Hillary Clinton. It turns out that's false. He is involved in technology companies, and there was reporting from the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal that I guess had confused this process. And let me just reiterate that most reporters really don't understand how the DNC works. I can't believe how much I've read today that is just false. Even people who cover the Unity Reform Commission attributed these reforms to Bernie Sanders. That's just false. The reforms were coming from these meetings were taped. So if you really want to sit down and watch like 40 hours of footage, feel free to. You can find those clips. But this app that was used, it has become immediately controversial because of who runs the app, who the clients of the app company are, and how the app is structured. And so we have Samuel Finkelstein, Sam, who is our Follow the Money expert, who has rushed to a camera to sit down with us and tell us a little bit about what this app is. So Sam, what's the name of the app and how is it structured? Let's just start off with that.
The name of the app is, well, the name of the company rather that manufactured the app is Shadow Incorporated, which is almost like too on the nose,
yes,
given the scenario that we now find ourselves in. But Shadow, on their website, they're extremely opaque as to who works there. They just give a vague description of being staffed by veterans of Hillary for America, Obama for America, Google, Apple, but no specific names. Mm-hmm. Some Twitter sleuths that were investigating this found a bunch of LinkedIn profiles for people who were executives at Shadow, and it confirmed that almost all of them were veterans of Hillary 2016. That seems to be the thread that connects all.
In their LinkedIns, just to break this down so we can verify it, they basically reverse engineered and went to LinkedIn to see who worked for the company and then found the CEOs and the people running the company.
Exactly. The company's website doesn't list who the CEO is, but the CEO's LinkedIn says he's the CEO. So, kind of just backtrack that way. But Shadow, the reason why their name is Shadow, in their words, they describe themselves as wanting to be like the shadow technical infrastructure of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement, and wherever, I'm not making this up, wherever there's light, there's always a shadow. So basically they're selling themselves as wanting to be the infrastructure of the left,
right?
Broad left.
So they started, Shadow is the company, but there is a parent company. Can you explain what this parent company is?
Yes. Shadow is an appendage of a larger group that's called Acronym, which...
They couldn't think of an acronym, so they just called it Acronym.
Exactly. Strange word choice. But Acronym also funds Acronym is funded by mostly just, billionaires, the kind of people who underwrite centrist democratic politics. And Acronym also funds a digital strategy firm that, according to the FEC, has never had a client, which is odd. It's called Lockwood Strategy. So if anyone wants to look into that, I encourage you to. They also have a super PAC called Pacronym, not making this up. So we can get into that also. And Shadow is a company that they founded. Now, this morning, Acronym obviously was getting tons of requests for comment from reporters, and they distanced themselves completely. They tried to make it out as though it's an arm's length relationship. All we did was seed the money and let the company be. How true that is, I have no idea. But
yeah, it was interesting because on MSNBC last night, I was on the Majority Report last night, and Sam Seder ran out of the studio and rushed over to MSNBC to do a late night segment with Chris Hayes. And on the panel, I don't know how Sam didn't punch him in the face, frankly.
David Plouffe.
Joke, exactly. David Plouffe. For those Obama veterans like myself, Plouffe, not Plouffe. Mook, not Mook. You got to get him right. So David Plouffe was on the panel, and he was distancing himself
as much as possible.
As much as possible. He's on the board of this company, Acronym, right?
Yes, he's on the board of the company, but he's a volunteer, and he described the company in an extremely bizarre way as being primarily a newsletter company. And to be clear, they do own a media outlet that seems fairly marginal. I've never heard of them. I think it's Courier and Post. But they do own a media outlet, but it's not Acronym is not a newsletter company. They created a company that is now ruining the Iowa caucus. So it's not a newsletter company.
Well, let's remind everybody who David Plouffe is. He was the campaign manager for Barack Obama, and he manager, correct?
Yes.
The second time around, yeah. And he ended up going to work as a lobbyist for Uber. If you recall the 2016 convention in Philadelphia, for those of you who weren't there, the convention was pretty far away from downtown. It was very hard to get to. The subway system was probably the most effective way, but it was very difficult for people to park, for people to walk into the convention. And so, how special it was that Uber was the main sponsor. And so there were these huge tents outside, these Uber tents that were set up like spas. And you'd have to wait there for, in some cases, hours for your Uber to arrive. It was the way you got around in Philadelphia. And of course, that's a huge contract for a company. And many former Obama people went on to go to Uber. But I digress. I just think it's a really great example of the crony, just how this is such an incestuous, it's become a cesspool for legalized corruption and patting each other's backs. And really, in the case of Hillary Clinton and her campaign, people around her rewarding people who just do not have any interest in winning elections. It's becoming very clear.
And just while we're on the subject of David Plouffe and Uber, his big thing was promoting Uber in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which, why not just mix those two things together?
Was he against women driving, and this was their solution?
It was. I don't.
That's where my mind was.
Progressive, that was the progressive solution. Women can just get shuttled around. So there's that, and you can confirm all of this on Uber's Twitter account if you don't want to take my word for it. But
so back to Acronym. So Acronym is structured. It's a for-profit company. It funds a super PAC that doesn't seem to do anything, and it funds a news entity and this app. It's not an investment firm. So is it really just is it possibly like a front group? I mean, how is this? What's going on here? Are people making money, or are they using it as a tool for disruption, or all of the above?
I want to stick to what I can, rather than speculate and get into conspiracy theories. I don't know if they're intentionally, just in the context of Shadow, I don't know if they're intentionally being disruptive,
Mhm.
but they're being very disruptive. As you said at the beginning of the segment, we have no idea what happened at the Iowa caucus, and it's specifically because of this app. And it's really incredible if you think about it. This company that we know has been seeded with millions of dollars from billionaires was unable to come up, like it had one job,
Yeah.
which was report the votes, let people log in and report like
That's a very simple app.
it's not complicated at all. Like I know people who are 15 who could probably program something like that if you gave them enough time. And this was also never tested at scale.
Right. So that's the other thing. We're talking about a state that has, 3.18 million people, not counting all of them I mean, how many voted, we don't know, but let's say 3/4, if we're being extremely generous, turned out and voted, which is extremely generous.
They were expecting 200,000.
Yes, exactly. It's a couple 100,000 but I'm just saying this is what you have to do for crazy situations, right? It's pretty much all primaries and caucuses are low turnout for the most part. They're usually somewhere between 12 to 25% if you're lucky. So this is a perfectly doable app, and we had signals from people on the ground saying it didn't work in the lead up. And I think this is something I just want to reiterate over and over. Why was this app contract rewarded? It's a very large contract for a very simple task. And really, I think the other aspect is, why were these people running it? Like, do they have the background to run this? Do they have the expertise to run it? You told me ahead of time there were some organizing directors and people on Hillary's team. Can we talk a little bit about who's part of the actual app team?
Yes. So the people on the team, they ostensibly, some of them do have like engineering backgrounds or back-end software backgrounds, specifically in the context of Hillary 2016. But again, this is very limited information. I only know about a handful of people on the board there, and we don't know how big this company is. Obviously, this is not something that they've ever done before. This is a dry run for them. And again, it was never tested at scale. So there were the early reports trickling in, like you said, about Iowa field directors calling the Democratic Party and being like, "Hey, like we can't log in. This isn't working." Days before, weeks before, and those were essentially ignored. I don't think that they had the capacity to deal with this. I guess if we're giving them a generous read that they're not bad actors, then they're just incompetent.
Right. Well, this is the famous team that relied on data in 2016, and data couldn't alert them that Wisconsin might be an important state to focus on. I do have it on good authority from a few DNC members that, quote, they forced Iowa to use the app and approved their plan very late. They didn't listen to the state parties, unquote. So, and they meaning Tom Perez, because Tom Perez and his rules committee, those are his people. And let's remind everybody that the rules committee is made up of people a good chunk of the people who are making money off of the status quo of the party, the way that the party is structured. They're the ones who are against having budget oversight. They're the ones who watered down our reforms that called for any oversight and accountability. So when you hear people on cable news spinning that this is because Bernie Sanders wanted to reform the caucuses, no. Let's be very clear. It's because Bernie Sanders wanted to have accountability and oversight in the party, and they refused to. It's how a contract was rewarded to friends and family or whatever, cronies of the people who brought us, Donald Trump, who failed to see the obvious on a map. So this is nothing to do. The caucuses themselves, we really don't even know the turnout. So I think that's something the press isn't doing well right now either. We don't know the turnout. But the caucuses themselves, even if it was lower turnout than expected, they still functioned. People still got to the polls. They had satellite caucuses for the first time ever. And that was a product of reforms from the commission and that were taken into account. But this app, which dictated the number of people, which is something so that you can see whether or not there are shenanigans on the ground, it malfunctioned. And of course, each campaign had their own version of the numbers. And so there is that. But, I want to go back to some of the conflicts here, because going back to acronym, you pointed out a funder named Seth Klarman. Is that his name? A hedge fund billionaire?
We'll go with that. Seth Klarman. Yes, he's a hedge fund billionaire, and up until very recently, he was a Republican donor. He funded, your corporate Marco Rubio type Republicans. And it was only when Donald Trump suggested that we should forgive Puerto Rico's debt that he flipped and started funding corporate Democrats that opposed forgiving Puerto Rico's debt. And the reason he would do that is because he owns $911 million of that debt. So he's obviously got a pretty big stake in that money getting to him. So he is the biggest funder. This is according to Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone. He's the biggest funder of Pacronym. So he's seeded them with millions of dollars, and he's seeded, Acronym with an unknown amount of money. But yeah, he's a big hedge fund guy, and he's also extremely involved in the far right pro-Israel, pro-settlement lobby in America.
So, okay, just to touch on Puerto Rico, because it's funny. It's like you look back at your life and like, how did I end up doing all these things that all, unite? But I covered the 2017 Cher's election, and I also covered Puerto Rico and the storm. And what I ended up learning very quickly on the ground in Puerto Rico, because politics is very complicated, is that statehood is actually a right-wing issue. It is not a Democratic issue, meaning Democratic Party. And of course, there's really no Democratic versus Republican Party in Puerto Rico. It's much more complicated. But there are people who identify as Democrats on the mainland, meaning here. And at the end of the day, there was a lobby by the conservative members in Puerto Rico, many of whom are these hedge funders who own debt, to push for statehood status in the Democratic Party, because there's a financial aspect attached to that. And so when Tom Perez was lobbying his votes, I think it's safe to say at this point that the Puerto Rican delegation of the DNC swung the votes for Tom Perez. And you can see, you can go back and look at photos of, at the time, the governor Rosselló, who has been ousted due to protests on the streets in Puerto Rico. He tried to privatize the entire country, essentially. And he was meeting with Tom Perez, lobbying for statehood. You look at some of the members on the DNC, including the Rules Committee, by the way, and you have folks who are consultants and involved in representing the hedge funders that are owning the Puerto Rican debt. This is a massive amount of money, by the way. It's almost $1 billion per person. It's crazy. We're not talking small time money. This is a place where there's taxation without representation on the island. People are getting taxed on, for imports and exports, and people are being forced off of their land. And of course, there's a whole real estate aspect of this for billionaires. So it is important to mention Puerto Rico because that actually aids to the structure of the DNC. And I will do a completely different segment on that. If you want to know more, I can name the names. It is, it's jarring, but Israel is a big part of this. We have the Israel lobby in the DNC, and the Puerto Rican lobby, which never gets enough attention and is confusing for a lot of folks, let alone just people who don't understand the DNC. So, all right, so these are some of the people. What else did you learn from your findings?
So one thing that I noticed last night that was definitely extraordinarily sketchy and kind of ties this all together is I went to Shadow's Twitter account. It's like @Shadow Incorporated or @Shadow Inc. And it's a relatively inactive account. They follow 79 other people. And of those 79, one of them happens to be a dark money group called Democratic Majority for Israel, which is the same group that launched those attack ads on Bernie Sanders in Iowa like a week ago.
$700,000, right?
$700,000 worth of attack ads, exactly. Saying that, oh, Bernie's too old, he had a heart attack, he can't beat Donald Trump. So it's just really odd that these groups would be connected, even just following one another on Twitter, because they're both totally unknown to the public until just now. And apparently they know each other. And then we find out that one of the And when I say that that guy Seth Klarman is a big like pro-Israel guy, I mean like he is the primary funder of a bunch of these sort of organizations like Democratic Majority for Israel. I don't know about that one specifically, but I know that he funds lots of groups that are just like that one in America. So it's really strange to see that connection.
He owns the Times of Israel too.
He owns the Times of Israel, exactly, which at one point published an op-ed that it later had to apologize for and scrub from the internet, which was titled like "When Genocide is Okay," in reference to like the Palestinian conflict. So these are not good people.
Yeah. So this leads to the next part, which is hate to bury the lead here, guys, but he's also a maxed out donor to Pete Buttigieg. And
he sure is.
I found it fascinating yesterday as this information was coming in that, Pete Buttigieg also uses this app. But to be fair, there were other candidates who use this app too. I think, again, this is a conflict of interest, and this is something that we tried to ban on the Democratic Party because we knew the conflicts of interest are cesspools for this type of situation. Not only is this firm, just as a side note, not it's a for-profit political company. Robbie Mook, funny enough, was on CBS this morning talking about how party operatives need to be out of the business of primaries and caucuses, and it really should be left to states. Well, I won't say if that's true or not at this point, but when you have operatives handing out projects to their friends, operatives also mingle in circles of campaigns as well. It's not just state parties, but campaigns. So Pete Buttigieg uses this app. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so you said that other campaigns have paid this company, and that's true, but Pete's paid almost double what the next campaign, which happens to be Kirsten Gillibrand, oddly enough, paid. So Pete paid $42,500 for software and subscription services. According to them, it's for texting stuff, but who knows? The Biden campaign has also paid them. The Iowa Democratic Party paid them $60,000.
Forced by the DNC.
Yes. The Nevada Democratic Party paid the same amount. And, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, I guess. The Wisconsin Democratic Party paid them a smaller amount, like $4,000. And yeah, so you talk about conflicts of interest with specifically regard to Pete Buttigieg. We know that one of his top strategists is married to one of the higher ups at Shadow, which is really interesting.
There was a tweet last night, and I think people say, oh, but that's, you can't guilt somebody for being married to someone. At the end of the day, your financial interests are aligned. And there's a reason why corporate governance and journalists used to work this way, and if you work for the government, you have to disclose your relationships. If you run for office in some sense, when I ran for office here, you have to disclose your relationships with people because of that. And so it's when you're in the business of elections, okay, you got to be able to disclose these things ahead of time. But there was a tweet that went out. Was it from one of the ranking, I don't know if she was a CEO, COO, where was she? Where she was cheering Pete Buttigieg running in the race. And
she's posted multiple tweets that are very enthusiastic pro Pete tweets.
Who was this though? This was I
have to find her.
But in the meantime, I mean, it's there's just so much information coming out here, and we're just giving you a recap, the top issues that came up, the top conflicts. But at the end of the day, it's, they're doing this out in the open, and I don't think that they're used to being called out. So what do we do moving forward? I think it really is going to come down to the muscle from Bernie's campaign. I personally don't see much of a path to victory for Pete Buttigieg, especially once he starts going to states like South Carolina and Nevada. But I think that the party is doing all they can to suppress any movement or positive press, frankly, from Bernie Sanders. I mean, we know that he didn't get the press today, as he should have, when the numbers that we did have were very clearly showing Bernie, in the lead. In the lead. How significant is the big question? But this is something that I think really rests on Chairman Perez. And in a week when Chairman Perez got away with a lot of stuff, I think as a movement, and if you're a DNC member watching this, I know I've spoken to a lot of you. There's a lot of frustration with this chairman, Tom Perez, who barely won, questionable about how authentic that win was, made a lot of promises, has not followed through on those promises, despite his Medium article a couple of days ago saying that all these reforms had happened. He actually moved for a unanimous vote in the DNC membership to approve of the Unity Reform Commission recommendations, and then it went right to his appointed Rules Committee, and they watered it down and eliminated things, and approved of contracts without discussion, without oversight, with the Executive Committee. So we have a real problem here. This isn't just bitching about budgets anymore like I used to. People, would roll their eyes. There's a reason why someone like Dr. Jim Zogby, who's been in the party for decades, and someone like me, we worked together, and I saw the future and really the effects of 2016 and 2008, my experiences in presidential politics. And he saw what the Democratic Party used to be and what it evolved into. And so here we are looking at one conflict of interest that disenfranchised the voters that turned out in Iowa and disenfranchised erased the work of all the campaigns that were on the ground for over a year, busting their butts in Iowa. The campaigns need to move forward, but we have to make sure that Tom Perez is held accountable. We need answers. And the answers should not be around whether or not the caucus should have reformed or not. If it didn't have the reforms, you'd be in the same situation. What it really comes down to is, why was this app rewarded to somebody who did not have a bid process or have a track record? Or the fact that it was rewarded so late, shoved down the throats of the Iowa party, forced to take out a contract with them, and then even a week prior, people were complaining about it. So just, I killed some time for you while you found the name. So Sam, who was this person?
So the strategist for Pete, who is married to this higher up at Shadow, is Michael Hale. That's Hale. Mm-hmm. And the strategist is, or rather, the person who he's married to. Mm-hmm. And now I can't find her Twitter.
I have a screenshot of it somewhere in here. Yeah, people were posting it last night, showing screenshots of her excited about Pete running, and she works for Shadow. Here it is. So Tara McGowan.
Yes.
And,
yeah, found her too.
And this is the crazy thing. Sam Cedar and I were talking about this. We've acronym. We've been around for a while, and there are a lot of people we know who are on these campaigns. We know their personalities. Some are very nice. Some are very smart. Some have that old parable about the frog boiling. They don't know when they kind of became corrupt. It just sort of happened. Some of these folks, we talked about this in the Majority Report last night. In 2008, they were the wholesome ones fighting against the system on the Obama campaign in Iowa. And then somehow, money, having families, your lives become more expensive. It can be a very rewarding industry, especially if there's no accountability, and especially if it's based on relationships. And so these people operate in tribes. And I think a lot of them resent, they might even think they're progressive, but they resent that Bernie Sanders and people who didn't come in through the system the way that they did are getting a seat at the table, and frankly, putting them potentially out of business. I know they resent me, and I did sort of, work in those circles for a while, never as a consultant, but I think they resent me personally for going after their money, and they will smear people as a result. So if I can leave, just to remind you guys, when you're out there on Twitter, I think you should call them out. I wouldn't repeat their messaging. I would say this is about the app. It's not about anything else. People want reform. I don't think anybody has ever said, oh, God forbid we reformed. Democracy is always a better solution than no democracy. It's the best thing we have. It's flawed, but it's best.
Speaking of democracy, I think it would be prudent if we spent a couple of minutes just talking about what played out at the end of last night,
right,
in terms of who said which campaigns said what, and because obviously it's 1:20 as of right now, and we still have no idea. There's no reported official vote totals whatsoever. I think the counter got up to 1.8% last night before they just suspended it entirely. So we have no idea who was. You can't even project out from that low of numbers who was in the lead. We have internal numbers from the different campaigns, and those are incomplete. They paint a picture, but it's not a complete picture. And I'm going to preface this by saying that in the run-up to the caucus, Politico, literally 2 days before the caucus, Politico published an article saying that two campaigns, which were unnamed, were concerned that Bernie Sanders was not going to respect the process and was going to come out and declare himself the victor before the results were totally tallied. And they, I don't know where they got this concern from, because that was what Hillary did last time, not what Bernie did. But what ultimately happened was Joe Biden contested the results. He actually had his general counsel send a letter to the Iowa Democratic Party, which he published, that said basically they should withhold the results until these irregularities are, sorted out.
I am sorry. He knows he's going to get called out by people who might have sympathy towards him, and that's essentially what happened today in the mainstream press. Is they were like, what Hail Mary is this? But keep going, because there's more. Wait,
yeah, and that was an exceptionally bad move, because all of the available reporting before the reporting just started to focus on this app was like, where are the Biden supporters? There are no Biden supporters. Biden's not viable here. Biden's not viable there. And now Biden demanding that they don't release the results at all. It's just awesome. But besides Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg last night went on stage to address his supporters, as all the candidates did. And I think his exact words were, "We don't have all the results, but from everything that we have, it appears that we are going to New Hampshire victorious." And, the crowd went wild, and I was sitting there, my jaw dropped, because this is coming in between broadcasts of the pundits saying that, the DNC, we don't know if we're going to getting the results tonight. And then Mayor Pete just calls the election for himself, with no confirmation from any official sources at all. And then this morning, let me first say, Bernie Sanders was extremely respectful of the process, as other candidates were, but really no one to the extent that Bernie was. He said that he expected, once the numbers came in, that they would be looking very, very strong, but he in no way implied that he did, that he won.
Yeah.
Which,
that could have been first, second, or third, frankly, but first or second. It's almost improbable that he didn't come in first or second place. I mean, most likely first. It's just how big that lead was.
I personally, from everything that I've been told, I'm confident that Bernie did come in first. Now, this is speculative because it's not official confirmation yet. But that being said, this morning, Pete Buttigieg was on CNN, and the anchor, to his credit, I don't know his name, asked Pete, so you said that you were victorious last night. What did you mean by that? And Pete kind of weaseled around it, saying that, from the information that they had, it was clear that they did better than expected, and they're very happy with their performance in such and such districts. And the anchor kind of cut in and was like, does that mean you won?
Right.
And Pete made it clear that he was using victorious more in a figurative way. It's a win for us.
Medicare for all, and then suddenly months later being, I'm anti-Medicare for all.
Yeah, in the sense that he was saying, the results look like a win for us. And he specifically said for us. Not a win in terms of who actually won, but a win in terms of we feel good about it. It was it was a moral victory for us and for Iowa. So obviously, when something like this happens and there's a vacuum, there's no information coming out, it's extraordinarily unethical for a candidate to come out and, in the absence of any official confirmation, while all the other candidates are waiting for that confirmation, to say, yeah, I'm the winner. Because Iowa awards a handful of delegates when it comes to the actual DNC. That's not what's important about Iowa. What's important about Iowa is the narrative, the momentum that you get coming out of Iowa. And let's say that Bernie Sanders was the winner. He was deprived of the opportunity to give that speech that, lots of people still remember Barack Obama's 2008 victory speech in Iowa. These are big moments for campaigns, and they kind of set the tone for the next primary and the next. And by not only, it sucks that Bernie, if it was Bernie, was deprived of that opportunity alone. But to compound that by having Mayor Pete, who just days before had the Des Moines Register withhold the final Iowa poll, which had Bernie in first place.
He's a mercenary, in my opinion. He was a mercenary in the chairs race. He's a mercenary in this race. Very similar, worse tactics now, but there's a similar game happening, and I think people see through it. Now, the real issue here that we'll be discussing as this campaign goes on is they know that they can't move Bernie supporters. They are unmovable. He can only grow in support. Everybody else,
in single digits. Pete's in single digits in New Hampshire in a lot of polls.
Everybody is losing support, and he has no path forward in South Carolina, in Nevada, in Texas, in California, where there's a large group of people of color. He doesn't have a path forward. So at this point, he is literally acting as a mercenary. And Biden doesn't have a path forward, it seems like. And Warren, I don't see her path growing. So ultimately, this is good for Bloomberg. And I want to know, who is Pete doing his work for? Because that was not a response of somebody who's living in the real world and knows the numbers. That is maybe, okay, I understand if he wants to keep raising money and stay in the race and deal the cards and, trade shits, whatever. But at the end of the day, that was such an egregious move. That is what you do when you think you have a path forward and you need to lock it down. He doesn't have that. And anybody who knows anything about politics knows he is not going to suddenly have 30% of the black vote, because that is what he would need to even squeak through.
And he's a numbers guy. He's a McKinsey guy. I'm sure he has, PowerPoints and Excel documents that, have all of the probabilities in all of the districts and all of the states. Like, they know that they are not a viable campaign for the long haul. So it really does beg the question, why would they jump the gun like this? When
Hillary Clinton, who needed to stifle Bernie.
I understand that. And personally, I was urging Bernie's campaign to do that before Pete did.
Right.
But that's neither here nor there because it didn't happen. The bottom line is Pete Buttigieg declared himself the winner when it was late, but still when everyone is still up and watching to see what happened. And then this morning at 9 o'clock, when nobody's watching except for, people who have an unhealthy addiction to news, then he kind of walks it back. And I haven't seen too much reporting that said that I've seen reporting that said Pete Buttigieg says he's the winner, not Pete Buttigieg is the winner. So,
it was pretty far. It was, I think that's ultimately it is reporters weren't willing to die on that,
I don't think they believe it.
No,
to be perfectly honest.
It was a trick that you use
when you're not actually the winner.
When you're not the winner. I noticed these kinds of tricks in local politics in New York a lot. You fake your way in, and if the margins can work out that way, then you get away with it. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, these people their messages only spread if they can get away with it. And so that's why it's important that we have these segments, because the reason why they could get away with the budgetary issues and getting these apps approved and contracts approved is because they get away with it. And it's really complicated and process isn't fun, but this is where they the process is where they screw us. And I'm gonna end right now with something that Sam Seder, on MSNBC last night. I think it was a perfect way to illustrate what's going on right now in this country. You have groupthink. Groupthink is a thing, right? But essentially, this meritocracy world that we live in has failed us. And it's not a meritocracy. It's not like the people who are failing their way to the top and patting each other on the backs and giving out contracts for each other are better at elections. I mean, they've proved to not be. This is a decade of losing, over 1,200 seats. These are people who have a lot of experience losing elections and researching data and making money off of it. They made more money than ever, they raised more money than ever, and they lost more seats than ever. And so, he has criticized this meritocracy at the top and the media that has reinforced it because they barter in these relationships. And the dismissal of grassroots campaigns and grassroots candidates at a time of income inequality, at a time where the internet gives voices to others, is only creating this battle. And it's really unfortunate that what gets thrown out the window is democracy. So, Sam, final note?
Yeah, in terms of democracy being thrown out the window, obviously, again, we don't know what the projections, if they panned out, but we do know that there were 5 caucus sites at mosques in Iowa. For the first time ever, a mosque had never served as a caucus site. And Bernie Sanders overwhelmingly swept those caucus sites. Spanish language caucus sites overwhelmingly swept those caucus sites. The first satellite caucus that reported was at a pork processing center. And these were primarily Ethiopian immigrant workers who, they were unionized, and their union went for Bernie, and 14 of 15 went for Bernie. So Bernie's whole theory of change is bringing people in to the electoral process who traditionally haven't participated. And I think that the real tragedy here is that may have actually worked.
Yes.
And the results are not worth what they should have been. And I can only imagine that that's a disheartening experience for all of those people who, if you're working 2 jobs, getting to a caucus site at 6 o'clock is not, and standing there for hours, it's not an easy thing. So, people were willing to make the investment of their time, the emotional investment. And I think that it really sours people. This is why people hate politics.
Right. That's right.
When things like this happen.
But it's not just caucuses. I just want to declare this. I mean, we went around the country for 2
Check
years.
your registrations.
Check your registrations. New York, a Democratic-run state. We have a little bit more of an open primary now, but for years we didn't. I've been purged. People have been purged. It's a real issue, and I think at the end of the day, for our own protection as a country, especially going into the general election, we should have a nationalized system of voting application. That's going to be a big fight. But at the end of the day, disheartening, but it's just a reminder of what we're fighting for. And it just exposed a little bit more of the shenanigans and the corruption, as I like to say. Frankly, it's fucking corruption in the DNC. So that's quoting myself. Sam, you're awesome. You guys, this is the pitch. You want more of this. This was a lot of work. Sam took up his morning investigating all of this and following the numbers. If you believe in this work, please go to patreon.com and become a patron. It's patreon.com/the Nomiki Show. There are different levels. We are going to be growing the show. We need to bring on more staff so that we can do segments out of the studio on a moment's notice, so we can put graphics up on the screen. Right now, we are really working hard to build the membership. Also, subscribe to us on YouTube. This is really what's going to make this show successful. And I promise you that we're going to deliver you the tools from my experiences or people we know to help inform you about what's going on in this primary process and pull back the curtain and also give you guys the tools to fight back. So remember, end of the day, when you're online, when you're talking to folks, remind them this comes down to an app that was a contract that was handed out to a crony. And there was no oversight. And they knew that there were problems ahead of time, and that's all this is about. So don't let them distract. just focus on what matters in the message. Sam Finkelstein, where can people find you? We're going to put it down in the bottom of the YouTube page, but
I can be found at cancel_Sam on Twitter. And, I encourage all of the viewers to follow me for, more excellent content.
He'll be back. All right. Thanks, Sam.